Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 441st episode, we have an interview with Brian Curtice. We also have a bunch of news, including I'm doing an Ankylosaur from Antarctica.
And I'm talking about an exciting sauropod find in Australia.
So we've got an Ankylosaur and a sauropod between us.
Surprise, surprise.
And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Priconodon, which is another Ankylosaur, specifically a Nodosaurid. So we've got a lot of Ankylosaur stuff, although Brian Curtice has a lot to say about sauropods, so it's maybe an even split. But before we get into all of that, we want to thank some of our patrons, and this week we have a new patron to thank, and that's Parasaurolophus. You know, like Aaron and Parasaurolophus.
I like it.
That's a good one. And of course, we have some more patrons to thank, and they are Alone Dingo, Elijah, L-Rex, Professor Herrerasaurus, Reed, Anne, James Pasco, Malleus, and Craig.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being part of our Know-It-All community.
Yeah, we also recently released our second episode of I Know Paleo, which is all about Quetzalcoatlus and other Azhdarchids. So if you are a patron at the Triceratops level and up, make sure to listen to that and vote in the poll for the next episode of I Know Paleo.
Could be anything, even Dimetrodon.
Well, it could be one of 7 things I think are in the poll, but yes.
I said that because I think that's the likely winner.
Oh yeah, it got second place last time. So now jumping into the news, we've got our new paper on Ankylosaur armor, and this one was written by Arthur Brum and others and published in Cambridge University Press. With Ankylosaur, they're specifically looking at specimens from Antarctica, new specimens from Antarctica.
Ooh.
Of course, we already have Antarctopelta. Big fans of Ankylosaurs know. Unfortunately, Antarctopelta is a pretty incomplete find. The main thing they got is teeth and a jaw. That's sort of the holotype, I think, might be the teeth.
So that doesn't tell us too much.
It doesn't. Unfortunately, there are some fragments of the skull, but not enough to tell a whole lot.
But that's good because with Ankylosaurs, the skull is arguably the most important.
It is, except in this case, the fragments are so small, I don't think they got anything really out of it.
No.
They did find some vertebrae and a decent amount of the foot, but like you said, the skull is where it's at. So it's like, it's nice that they got that, but it doesn't do much. And they did find a little bit of armor.
Nice.
And in this study, they do include 2 Antarctopelta osteoderms to compare to the new osteoderms.
Got it. So even though the skull is the important part for Ankylosaurs, at least when it comes to naming, I think personally the osteoderms are the exciting things.
They are. Well, I'll get into it a little bit in the fun fact, but on the skull, it's like the osteoderms on the skull, basically, which are the important, unique thing about Ankylosaurs and help define the species.
Best of both worlds.
Yep. As the authors put it, quote, there has been an overall bias towards sampling ankylosaurian remains from the northern hemisphere with limited quantitative studies on the morphological and functional evolution of the osteoderms composing their body armor, end quote. So in other words, there hasn't been a whole lot of analysis of body armor, period, because we're mostly looking at skulls. And in general, the ones we're looking at are from the northern hemisphere. Even though there is a decent amount in the southern hemisphere, especially South America, there's a lot of nodosaurids that we found. So these authors aim to remedy that by studying more southern hemisphere ankylosaurs. And in their data set, they include 2 indeterminate ankylosaur osteoderms, 8 ankylosaurid osteoderms, 16 nodosaurid osteoderms. Not surprising that there are more nodosaurid tail clubless than ankylosaurid tail club having osteoderms, since South America has a lot of nodosaurids, not quite as many ankylosaurids. They also threw in 3 titanosaurian osteoderms.
Oh, for good measure.
Yeah, as a reminder that some titanosaurs had osteoderms, although, yeah, we don't necessarily think they were for armor. They might have been for storing calcium and things like that.
Sure, but just a reminder of how awesome sauropods are.
Yeah. I like that, especially the saltosaurids and stuff that have the osteoderms. And it's good that they included those too, because if you're finding isolated osteoderms, you should include all the things that it could be from, not just ankylosaurs.
Because maybe it was an Antarctic sauropod.
It could be. There is, I didn't think there had ever been any finds of Antarctic sauropods but I looked up on PaleoBio database just to double check, because every time I'm going to make a claim like that, I
Yep.
always check. And there is one indeterminate like fragment of a sauropod from one of the islands of Antarctica.
Oh.
So we couldn't say, even if these osteoderms were from a sauropod, that they were the first ever evidence.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like the second evidence, but we have very little. And it would be cool if we found a sauropod, like a real nameable sauropod from Antarctica one of these days. So these two new osteoderms came from the PaleoAntar expedition in 2015, and PaleoAntar is an acronym for expeditions to the Antarctic Peninsula near South America, mostly by researchers in Brazil. That's the name of their program. I think it's a super long abbreviation of a whole bunch of stuff that they came up with to make it PaleoAntar, but I'm not positive about that. As a side note, I found out that Brazil lost an Antarctic research station in 2012 due to a fire.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was really tragic. 2 Navy lieutenants were killed in the fire.
Oh.
And it's like, that wasn't that long before the museum in Rio burned down either. Brazil has had some really bad luck with fires at research facilities in the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, they think a short circuit in the power generator room caused an explosion and a subsequent fire, which eventually destroyed about 70% of the station, which was located on King George Island. I don't think that's an island we've talked about before, because I don't think there's any paleontology happening on that island. After the fire started, 30 scientists, an alpinist, an environmentalist, and 12 soldiers were evacuated by helicopter, and the other 12 soldiers stuck around to fight the fire. Fortunately, though, in 2020, they opened a new Antarctic station, which was very positive. It sounded like it was a really uplifting ceremony and everything. That station isn't used directly by PaleoAntar. It's run by ProAntar, which studies the environment.
Oh.
But scientists are always collaborating and stuff, so occasionally they'll get like some sort of resource or stop there on the way or things like that.
Some of the best research is multidisciplinary.
Yes. I saw one quote from somebody who works on PaleoAntar saying, like, we really hope this ProAntar station gets an icebreaker, because that would make it so much easier to like get where we need to go. So they could get some advantages from it. The 2 new osteoderms came from the same area of the James Ross Island where Antarctopelta was found. So obviously the most simple explanation would be, oh, these are just Antarctopelta osteoderms. And if we were in the 1800s or early 1900s, they would have just called them Antarctopelta osteoderms and we would have been done with it, because that was good enough back then. But they wanted to do more than that. So they analyzed these 2 new osteoderms, plotted them 1,700 different ways. I made that number up, but a lot of different ways against all the other osteoderms that they have to compare, where they know where they came from, to see what they look the most like. And what they found is that they look the most like late diverging nodosaurid osteoderms. Late diverging means that they're more derived, is what we usually say, or farther down the dinosaur family tree. It's the opposite of basal. Something like a Tyrannosaurus rex is much more derived than something like Guanlong, for example. So presumably, these osteoderms came from a more derived nodosaurid. We can't know for sure because we don't have any of the skeleton, but they have the most in common with these derived nodosaurid osteoderms. I was secretly hoping that it was going to be from a titanosaur.
Yeah.
Because it would be cool, too, if it was like Antarctopelta and a titanosaur together. It's still cool because it's Antarctopelta and a different Ankylosaur, because Antarctopelta is not a nodosaurid. The key features that they used to assign the osteoderm to a nodosaurid was that the core is highly vascularized, meaning lots of blood vessels, and the outside of the osteoderms are thinner with sets of ordered perpendicular structural fibers. Presumably, those structural fibers allow them to be a little bit thinner, and titanosaurs share some of those features. In titanosaurs, like I said, they might have used that as an ability to occasionally take calcium from the osteoderms, like a tiny camel hump of calcium, basically. The authors propose that the ability, quote, may have played a key role in nodosaurid colonization of high-latitude environments, such as Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, because we've also found them way in the north. In other words, that mineral storage in the osteoderms might have enabled nodosaurids to spread out where other animals couldn't because they could store up some calcium, maybe some other minerals and things, and venture out into areas where for months those resources might not be available and use their stores, like for laying eggs, for example.
Yeah.
Their analysis of Antarctopelta didn't put it in either Ankylosauridae or Nodosauridae. Instead, Antarctopelta was in an early separate group with Kunbarasaurus and Stegouros.
Ah, you love bringing up Stegouros.
I do, but the reason I'm bringing up here is this isn't the first time that somebody has talked about a new group of those three dinosaurs. The group was given its own name, Parankylosauria, like next to Ankylosauria.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually named in the paper that described Stegouros in 2021. But I don't think I mentioned it. I usually don't mention a group name until at least a few research teams use it.
In case the name changes or they decide, nope, never mind, we're not using this group name.
Yes, and very often in scientific papers, you'll see researchers just make up a word because they're like, this is this great word I came up with. And sometimes it's like there's already a word that's just as good for that. Or like you said, people don't agree with it. And then, yeah, so the first time it's mentioned a lot of times, I'm just like, okay, we'll see. Take it easy with the naming lots of things. But in this case, it looks like the Gondwana-specific ankylosaur group named Parankylosauria is going to be a thing. And Stegouros, again, has a really cool tail weapon, which looks like a makwa huik, sort of like an axe with a dozen points on it. It's the best way I can describe it. Sort of flat, side-to-side axing. We don't have the end of Antarctopelta's tail, but we do have some vertebrae leading up to it that have a lot in common with Stegouros. So it's possible that Antarctopelta may have had a makwa huik-like tail. The same could be true for Kumbarasaurus, but we need more fossils because I think we don't have enough. Like we don't even get as close as we do on the Antarctopelta tail to make that sort of inference.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that the new osteoderms are from the same area as Antarctopelta. They didn't even come from the same group as Antarctopelta, since Antarctopelta is in that Parankylosauria, but instead it looks like these new osteoderms came from a nodosaurid. That would mean that nodosaurids and Parankylosaurians coexisted in Antarctica, in like that same spot on James Ross Island even, which does put a bit of a monkey wrench in the nodosaurids were special so they could live on Antarctica idea.
Oh, true.
Because Parankylosaurians were living there too. So maybe Parankylosaurs were also special. They did say, quote, growth pattern in long bones of Antarctopelta indicate they were pre-adapted to the colonization of higher latitude environments, end quote. So maybe they managed to thrive in Antarctica without special osteoderms that derived in these nodosaurids by basically not growing all the time or like pausing, maybe going into like estivation or hibernation or who knows what they were doing.
Sure. Yeah, because even though Antarctica was a lot more, I'd say, hospitable back then, with a lot more vegetation and stuff, it's still in an area where like it's dark for months out of the year.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the big problems, especially when you're an herbivore.
Speaking of the southern hemisphere, and actually we'll get into a little bit of Antarctica here, there was a Diamantinasaurus skull recently described that helps show the connections between titanosaurs on multiple continents. And by that I mean Australia and South America specifically. So this was published in the Royal Society Open Science, so it's open access, you can read it, by Stephen Porapat and many others, including Philip Mannion and Adele Pentland, who has been on our show talking about some Australian discoveries before.
Yeah. We had a great time hanging out with them in the outback.
Now, this skull is the fourth specimen of Diamantinasaurus that has been found. Before this skull, only one partial skull had been found before of Diamantinasaurus. And this one includes a more complete skull and part of the skeleton. And it's the most complete sauropod skull found in Australia so far.
Nice.
Yeah. And because it's an Australian specimen, it's got a nickname. This one is nicknamed Anne. Now, Anne had the same teeth as the other Diamantinosaurus skull, and that's how we know Anne is a Diamantinosaurus. Specifically, Anne had replacement teeth, and Anne's skull helps us understand a lot more about early titanosaurs. the skull shape is more similar to brachiosaurids than derived titanosaurs. There you go, using that word derived again.
Mm-hmm.
Other titanosaurs had more long, low skulls, more similar to diplodocus.
Yeah, I always think of Brachiosaurus with that big bump in the middle of its head.
Yeah.
Which, depending on how you interpret it, is either where the nostrils were or sort of where the nostrils ended in the internal thing. Like maybe the openings were actually more in the front of the head.
I was thinking how it's just more of a boxy look
It is.
compared to a diplodocus or an apatosaurus.
That's true. Diplodocus has a really long head.
Yeah. So with Diamantinasaurus, it likely had a boot-shaped snout like brachiosaurids and Sarmientosaurus, and it had a rounded lower jaw.
It's funny to describe its head as boot-shaped.
Yeah.
I guess it kind of is.
Especially for a sauropod, but yeah, boot-shaped and just kind of round. Diamantinosaurus, they're thinking could eat at least 3 feet or a meter above the ground, probably 20 to 23 feet or 6 to 7 meters above the ground, based on having this rounded snout. And also, there's not much sign of wear and tear on the teeth from soil or grit. Although we're not sure exactly what it ate, just something higher up the ground.
Somewhere between 3 feet and 23 feet.
Yes.
It's quite a range.
The teeth were found only in the front of the snout, so it probably stripped off its food, didn't chew it. And it replaced its teeth somewhat slowly because there were only 2 replacement teeth in each tooth socket. So, I mean, fast for compared to a human, but slower compared to other dinosaurs.
Yeah, because some sauropods, I think, are some of the fastest that are like every 30 days getting a new tooth.
Yeah. Now, as I mentioned, the skull had a lot in common with Sarmientosaurus, which is a titanosaur that lived in what is now Argentina, though Ann's skull is slightly larger than the holotype skull of Sarmientosaurus. But these 2 dinosaurs were closely related, and this discovery of the Diamantinosaurus skull helps with the theory that dinosaurs moved between Australia and South America through a land connection in Antarctica. See? Told you to come back to Antarctica.
You did, yeah.
Now, both Diamantinosaurus and Sarmientosaurus lived around the same time, about 95 million years ago, and they both lived at nearly the same paleolatitude, 50 degrees south for Sarmientosaurus, 48 degrees south for Diamantinosaurus.
That's pretty far south.
Mm-hmm. And they lived during the Cenomanian-Turonian, which, in the paper they said, quote, is regarded as the warmest interval the Earth has endured in the past 150 million years.
That sounds warm.
Yeah. As we know, sauropods liked warm climates, or at least we've talked about that in previous episodes. Antarctica at the time had a lot of forests and vegetation, so easier to pass through. Now, sauropod skulls, they're fairly rare, although I will say that depends on who you ask, because we've talked to a few people that said they're not that rare, but I think most people think that they're rare.
It depends on what you mean. So it's like, are you talking about the number of sauropod genera where we have a skull? In that case, they're rare.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're saying like the absolute total number of sauropod skulls,
Right.
we've got a lot because we have a ton of sauropods.
That's
so
true.
Like, is it a percentage or is it a like count?
Yes. Now, Ann's skull, the Diamantinosaurus skull, was found on a sheep station near Winton, Queensland, in Australia in 2018. It's the second sauropod skull found in Australia. As I mentioned, there was that partial skull found of Diamantinosaurus. That was back in 2016. Ann's skull has signs of distortion from being scavenged or trampled. They reconstructed the skull digitally after they CT scanned the bones, and the skull is nearly 20 inches or about 50 centimeters long. They said it was, quote, almost entirely disarticulated, end quote. So I'm sure it took some time to piece back together.
So if it's 20 inches long, I should have done the math on like what size boot that would be. And I'm guessing it's more of the shape of like a Timberland, you know, like a hiking boot or a work boot than it is like a rain boot. Not like an Italy boot shape. This is more of like might be getting too into the boot analogy.
But you do you.
20 inches long is pretty long though.
Yeah.
That's a big head.
Dinosaurs were big, or some dinosaurs were very big.
Especially considering like you look at a sauropod head and you're like, that's so small compared to the rest of its body, but like 20 inches.
Yeah. Well, sauropods have big bodies.
Half a meter. It's a lot.
In addition to the partial skull, which included the brain case, they found ribs, a tail vertebra, part of the pelvis, and parts of the legs and feet. and was a subadult, about 49 feet or 15 meters long and weighing 20 to 22 tons. They found that Ann's skull was similar in size to the holotype of Diamantinasaurus, but Ann was probably more gracile based on the hind limb fossils that they found.
A little skinnier.
Slender.
And in just a moment, we'll get on to our interview, but first we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now onto our interview with Brian Curtice. But of course, as always, we have an extended version of this interview. So if you'd like to check that out and you're a patron, make sure to check out your premium content feed. We're joined this week by Dr. Brian Curtice, a paleontologist who studied dinosaurs on 6 continents and lectured all over the world. He's a sauropod specialist and the founder of Fossil Crates and PaleoPortals. Thank you very much for joining us this week.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm super excited. A big fan of I Know Dinos. Your work is tremendous as science communicators and sharers of knowledge. Even your emails that you send out every week. I love scanning them for the bullets and highlights to see what did I miss. You're both so thorough. So thank you for what you both do. It's awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to ask is, you're now a sauropod expert, but were you always a sauropod guy, or were there other dinosaurs that were in your early life?
Since I was a fetus, it's always been the long neck, long tailed, heavy body terrestrial tetrapods. The strange thing is, recently I feel like I've been stepping out on them, because as PaleoPortals, Fossil Crates, and now Express Exhibits, as our companies go do other things, I've been forced is too strong of a word, encouraged. I've been encouraged to look at animals outside of my beloved sauropods. So as a result, I'm now looking at Paleoloxodon and Megalodon and a variety of critters with fur that I was horrified to know even existed, but now I'm delighted, at least a tad. And plus dinosaurs. Turns out there are things called Ankylosaurs, stegosaurs, these meat eaters. I had no idea. So yeah, but still, I've always studied sauropods. It's been since a wee lad. The meat eaters were, I guess, were cool, because I love all dinosaurs. I just love sauropods more equally.
Yeah.
I know how you feel.
Well, you're branching way out. You're not even just Mesozoic, not even just dinosaurs and birds. You're in the aquatic stuff and the Paleogene, all that.
Yeah, so I go from being a hardcore, I chase tail on 6 continents, and hopefully Antarctica, as I study the sauropods caudal vertebrae. There's a lot of phylogenetic pulse and functional morphological information locked into those bones. And because they have 50 to 80 plus vertebrae, the likelihood of it being preserved is much higher, number one. Number two, they are typically more robust than any other vertebral element. And so, again, likely to be preserved. Number three, the base of the tail is ensconced in massive amounts of meat. So when they die, you often get the first 2 presacrals, the pelvis, and then the first 12 or so tailbones in articulation.
Oh, okay.
So it's a really nice area to study, because it allows you to make good comparisons across all of the sauropods that have been discovered in all the different taxonomic groups. The downside is it carries almost an unnatural weight when you look at how cladograms are created, because you have more of those to choose from and better preservation. So often you'll find a large number of caudal characters. And so animals that are known from mostly tailbones, they're going to group with others of tailbones because of the overwhelming number of characters. So there are some interesting things I've learned over time, bias-wise, that when you have a bounty of riches compared to, say, a mid-cervical specialist, yeah, there's good luck. It's like the Yeti.
Yeah.
And outside of the sauropods now, I'm actually involved in research even, which is even more cringy to my inner child, but cool to my grayer-haired self. Like the Seriema paper that just came out. I looked at a living theropod, the Seriema, Cariama cristata, and how it uses its killing claw. Fowler and his crew back in 2010 and 11 came out with some papers that talked about Seriema claws. And we dug in much deeper and were able to access them in the cage at some local zoos, because I have 8 Seriema nearby. And then we went to Salt Lake City, where they have Seriema that were wild captive as opposed to hand raised. And we did a lot of cool, just eyes on studies with these birds, how they use their claws on mice, on lizards, on insects, how they hunted, and we did a bunch of videotaping and just cool studies that you can't do with any other animals because they're just extinct and I've got their bones.
Yeah.
So that was a neat project.
Did they use their claws differently on mice versus insects versus?
No, so surprisingly, they use their claws the same way on everything, which was they used them as a manipulation device.
Huh.
So they would jump upon a lizard or a mouse and they would use that claw and they would hook in and they would pin it to the ground. And then they have a hooked beak and they would use that tip of the hooked beak to snip and get a good grip and then just rip its head back and take a chunk of meat off. And so we hypothesized that any animals with these smaller animals with these big claws, they weren't using it to leap kick. They weren't using it to slash their prey or gut the jugular. Though Velociraptor fighting with the Protoceratops has the claw underneath the neck. I think that was more a fact of a 300-pound animal rolled over on it and it was just kicking wildly to get free, and that's how it died. They use these as to steer. There's surprisingly nothing written in the bird literature because they're out in Brazil and Argentina. They're very common there. They're kept as almost pets to keep the snakes down. They love to eat snakes and kill snakes.
Rather than cats.
Yes, it's their version. It's the two-legged cat.
That's so much cooler.
What was awesome was 2 of them had never seen a snake before. So we threw a plastic snake in and it cautiously walked around. It instantly went on full alert. It was amazing. It walked around it, pecked at it, picked it up, raised it up high, and then slammed it onto a rock like it was trying to break its back. And the zookeeper was astounded because the cerium had never seen a snake before. And it doesn't do this level of hostility to other small vertebrates. But when it saw the snake, it lost its mind and went into pure primal mode. And it took care of the fake snake, and it was unhappy with it. I have a YouTube clip on our site where it took a snake and took it 12 different times, bashed it on rocks just over the course of different meetings. They really don't like snakes.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's something about snakes. I mean, humans have similar. The first time you see a snake, you don't need someone to tell you, like, that's a snake. You shouldn't go near it.
At least out in the wild.
Yeah.
In my undergrad as a physical anthropologist, we worked on primates, and there were primate researchers who would show us footage of baby primates seeing snakes for the first time in absolute recoil, terror, horror, and they don't like them. So it's something that snakes apparently have done us dirty way back when.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they can be really deadly. There are parts of the world where they're like one of the leading causes of death. So yeah, stay away from snakes.
Oh, so snakes. I've had my fair share of snake encounters.
Oh, really?
Black mambas, green mambas, rattlers, Cape cobras. Each time was my fault. Each time I was not paying attention to my surroundings. So I'm climbing up a hill on my hands and knees, looking for small vertebrates. Why is a sauropod guy looking for small vertebrates? That's because he's a graduate student and that was his task that day. And you don't push back to your graduate advisor when you're day 15 in the middle of South Africa on a 60-day tour. So you're climbing the hill and my backpack got stuck on a rock. So I was dragging behind. I was kind of dejected because I don't see well without my glasses. I can see what I can touch. So sauropods I can see without my glasses. So it's pretty handy. But in this case, I'm looking for small critters. It gets stuck on something. I pull the pack, go up the hill. I'm coming back down, head first down, and I wonder what's under the rock. Well, at this point, it's been 10 minutes or so, and the coiled Cape cobra that now had the sun warming it up had decided he was less than thrilled with my presence on the hill. So there's no fossils on that hill as far as I was concerned. He was moving around. A couple days later, I'm crawling in the jungle, hands and knees again, and I'm looking for some stuff. I think I might have seen some bone fragments. I look up, and there is a green mamba hanging in a tree. Its tongue is about 8 inches from my face, and it's sniffing the air, and it's deciding if I live or die, because if I get stung, we're 8 hours away from the nearest any kind of help. So I just look at it and stare at it in its black, cold death eyes and back up slowly as it takes the air and decides I'm not worth the venom, thankfully. So he let me go.
Apparently you have good like snake energy that they just want to be up next to you. They're not upset.
Yeah.
They're just like,
Just
hey.
want to hang out.
Yeah,
One of us.
I'll take that. In South Africa, one of the reasons I was actually looking for small things is I don't like heights. I'm terrified of heights. They decide that we're going to go look on this gravity steep cliff. We say, okay, I don't like this at all. So Scott Sampson helps get me down the cliff, and we're on the cliff face, and he and some others are Kathy Forster. They're bounding about like mountain goats, or in this case, hyrax. They're all over the place. I'm utterly terrified. So I decide I'm not going to die on this hill today. So I sit down dejected, and I have my ice pick that you use in fossils. You always got your pick on you. You're just a little stabby. And I kind of just am stabbing the ground aimlessly. And I plink, and immediately I know I have hit bone. I know that sound, metal on tooth. So I uncovered, sure enough, I hit a tooth. And it's like, wow, well, that's cool. And I start excavating and I find a skull. But I just take a little bit out. And then I go back a little bit and I find dorsal vertebrae.
Wow.
I go down, I find some limbs. So I keep this thing as uncovered as possible because I don't want to damage it, because we're in the field and we got a long time to go. So it turns out that I find a complete baby dinosaur.
Wow.
And it is absolutely cool to know that I found it, and it was named recently. They didn't name it after me, but they called it out in the acknowledgments. And thank you, Brian Curtice, for your special field work. So at the end of the day, when they all come back from finding nothing but seeing cool critters and defying death, because if you fell, you rolled down into Cobra River. So if you survived the fall, the snakes were going to get you.
Oh, man.
Or the crocs that live there, or the varanid lizards, which are terrifying in the wild. Thankfully, none of that happened, and I produce a complete skeleton. And so last year, they named it, and I'm trying to find the paper, because it's really cool. It's like Ayuku was its name. And it's a little ornithopod.
Yeah, that name sounds familiar. I remember seeing that one.
Yeah, it's Iyuku Rathi. And they named it after Michael Rath, who Rath is one of the kings of paleontology in South Africa. And we met Michael because he did some work on sauropods, and we went out to find the sauropods, and we didn't consult with him first. And that, in hindsight, we just got lucky again, because when we go back, he says, "Where did you go?" And we said, "Well, we found your Brachiosaurus site." Wait, you went there? Like, yeah. He says, "You realize that's where the Rhodesian War was fought, and elephants today get their legs blown off on landmines still." So you did what? Yeah, we went prospected for a week looking for stuff. So it was another lucky experience, but it was cool. And so now I'm happy to say that I dug that animal out of the ground, and I was very careful. But even though it was a tiny animal, I took great care as if it was a sauropod caudal.
Fieldwork can be dangerous.
Yes. People chased us there. We survived near-death encounters with hostile locals multiple times. I had off-road driving a van, left-hand shifting on a way overloaded VW microbus, off-roading through the desert as a giant dually flatbed truck loaded with people with pitchforks jizzery out of Frankenstein chased us.
Oh, man.
On a long off-road desert chase.
Back to your fieldwork skills, you said you immediately realized when metal hit bone. Like, that's got to be something that, I don't know, someone who's experienced, like, that sound.
I don't think I would notice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you hit it enough times. So I was fortunate in the fact that I got to spend 3 years at the Dry Mesa Dinosaur Quarry excavating a bone salad of the Morrison Formation where the Supersaurus holotype was discovered. And I've also worked in a number of other Jurassic quarries, as well as Early Cretaceous, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. For many years, I'd go out in the field in the summer. And you hit dirt and it goes through, but bone is made of hydroxyapatite. And then it absorbs, as the water rolls through, it absorbs the minerals that are around it. And so bone and teeth, they just have a different feel and sound to them most times. There's places like Dinosaur Monument where it's all hyperindurated sandstone. It's a nightmare. You don't want to work there. You hit and it hits back. But most quarries aren't that hard of matrix. And so the bone is a separate layer of separate type of hardness. It's harder than the surrounding matrix usually. So as you're going through, it has a different feel and sound, and it's one that makes you smile immediately. There's so many discovery points. When you look at a fossil, you know where it was found because there'll be a divot, there'll be a chunk, there'll be a metal indentation that you think, oh, that's a tooth mark. No, that was somebody's hitting it with a chisel. And then they back off and they surface, they go slow. One of my favorite examples, and I should put this on our blog, on the Fossil Crates blog, is when it's discovered by bulldozer. Unfortunately, it is a gorgeous, beautiful, new Supersaurus cervical vertebra that helps us position where the infamous 9024 goes. It's not up around number 7. It's truly back around 14. Why? Because we found around number 7. But it was found via bulldozer that just happened to scrape the entire left side of it is completely gone.
Oh.
It took it halfway down the centrum. And unfortunately, the other side was laid up for a long time and is badly weathered before it was preserved. So the side that had the good detail is gone, but it's a beautiful green. It's this green clay. So it's a unique specimen, but it was bulldozer discovered.
Wow.
Which I hadn't seen.
Sometimes it works out okay. Like Borealopelta, I think, was also a bulldozer discovery and like a quarry, but they split open where the gut contents were. And they're like, we would have never done this, but since it's already open, look at all this detail you can see inside.
I love it. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good is the phrase, I believe.
Exactly.
And I'll take that kind of luck. I saw Borealopelta in person, and what a great specimen.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost like, now that my hair is gray, Gandalf the Grey. I'm this wandering wizard that bounces around to museum collections because I'm always on the hunt for sauropods. And the reason I was up there was I had had a hot rumor from my mentor, Yoda, the late Jack McIntosh. In the Mecca of Cretaceous, they had some Jurassic Apatosaurus cervical.
Oh, weird.
So I drove up there to see for myself, and sure enough, they did. So I have now learned, even if you are King Cretaceous or Queen Cretaceous, you may very well have some sauropod in your collection. And so I go look through the drawers, and you go look in whale rooms too. Sometimes sauropod material is oversized, and so it's stored in a different part of the building or off-site if you're unlucky, which happens sometimes too.
That's funny. Yeah.
I'm looking at you, Texas. For whatever reason, a lot of the Texans like to put their sauropod material in buildings that aren't where the other stuff is.
You mentioned Cretaceous sauropods. Alamosaurus is a Cretaceous sauropod, and basically one of the only ones in North America, at least as far as they're currently categorized. Have you ever looked at Alamosaurus? Do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I actually published a paper on the Alamosaurus from the North Horn Formation. That was a fun paper to do because it was more of a historical piece. And I found that since I didn't video record a lot of these, I have some notes. It's time that I put these notes down. And the reason I wrote it was, rewind the clock. The Alamosaurus that was found in the North Horn Formation, Gilmore published a photo of the locality, and he listed the elements he found there. And he said that there was a pelvis that he left in the ground because it was uncollectible. It was just too damaged. And Jensen, who is one of the world's greatest collectors, he decided that he'd go back and find it. And Jim Jensen spent a couple hours. He knew, he's like, I'm in the right spot, but he's got the picture of the quarry. He's holding the picture up. He's like, I cannot find this quarry. And he's sitting there on this rock as he tells the story to me. And he's frustrated because he's near. He can taste it, but he can't find it. And then Jensen was actually an artist. There's no formal paleo training. He was an inventor, and he was a painter, and he was a photographer. And he then wonders, I wonder if when they published the paper, if they flipped the negative, they reversed it. So he turns the picture around, and sure enough, he says, I immediately see it. I walk right over to it.
Wow.
And he finds it, and then he goes, yeah, Brian, it was just brown paint. It was uncollectible. I thought about taking the whole block out, but no amount of Vinac is going to bring this thing back. But while he was there, he found additional limb material, the head of a humerus, the head of a femur, some caudal vertebrae. Talk about lucky. One of the caudal vertebrae was split right down if you took the line, sagittally split. It was split in such a way that you could open it. I found out about it because they put it, and you don't know it's split. You go to pick it up, and it'll fall off. I have a sign on it now. It's like, do not pick up. It's two pieces. It doesn't look like it. Goes back so perfect. And you can see the inside of this vert. It's gorgeous. So you don't need a CT scanner on that one. So Jensen found it, brought it back, and some lads from Berkeley went out, found some additional material. So I was able to write up to just put these in the literature. I mean, they're just the proximal ends of some Alamosaurus. They're nothing particularly significant per se, but it was pretty cool. And then Juan Langston Jr. showed me the Alamosaurus material that he had on display. And then Dale Winkler and Lou Jacobs in 95 showed me a bunch of Alamosaurus they had. None of those lads at the time would let me do more than look at it. I took some pictures because they were under study. So I believe those came out a couple of years ago in some literature that was done. The Ankylosaurus is now mounted in the Perot Museum. And then there's always the Paluxysaurus, which is a legitimate taxon. Don't let people tell you otherwise. They're wrong. You could compare the Sauroposeidon material, the holotype, with Paluxysaurus, and you can see their different taxa. So why the folks said it wasn't is beyond perplexing to not only myself, but Matt Wadle. He's like, Brian, I don't get it. So we're working on hey, Paleontolosaurus is legit. So that'll probably be 700 days or so. We've got a lot of things we're working on. We have a Haplacanthosaurus paper that's going to be at the Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystem. We went and looked at Haplacanthosaurus delphi because it got naked. Cleveland Museum remounted it, so they took it down and sent it to Research Casting International, who took up all the paint and restoration. And they did the same with YPM 1980, the holotype of Brontosaurus excelsus.
Oh yeah,
I can't. I'm under a gag order to not tell you that Brontosaurus is no longer valid, but I can't do anything about that until I publish the paper. But yeah, let's move along. Next question.
That's gonna bum out Sabrina because Sabrina's favorite dinosaur is Brontosaurus. But it'll just go back to Apatosaurus again, I guess.
Yeah. That's what science is. That things are always changing.
And the last bit, and I'm going to call it here, it's called a posotype. It's my personal, it's going to be a crusade in 2025. I'm building it. I'm in preseason right now. I'm training. You've got holotypes, lectotypes, paratypes. Well, I'm coming with the posotype. And that is when there's a paucity of information, but you still felt the need to name it because it's the only bone in a new formation. I get that. Look at Jim Kirkland. He's done so much work in areas where no one had worked. So everything is new. But then if you have scrappy bones for your taxon, it's a holotype. But when we find a new specimen, and you can take any of the classic 1880s dinosaurs, YPM 1920, the holotype of Diplodocus is my favorite because it's the genotype, but it's a couple of caudals and a cool looking chevron. We now have near complete skeletons. Why in the universe do we still refer back to a holotype of something that is arguably not even diagnostic to the genus level? Just because the ICZN made it so and they're the all-be powers? No, we can evolve as a science. If our knowledge evolves everywhere else, why are we stuck with this Linnaeus from the 1650s, whenever he came up, 1700s, and he came up with this stuff? And it worked, and it was great. But for our field, we should be looking at more creative ways of doing our naming and conventions, because it's incongruous to logic that I am forced to go back to some scrappy tooth taxon, and that's what we all have to go take when we have a complete skeleton. So say, hey, the name Diplodocus comes from this posotype, but this and today, because they tried, and people are trying still, we're going to move it over to something else.
Yeah,
let's use better preserved specimens. Neotypes. But in order to meet the rules of the neotype, it's like the original had to have been burned and lost in a fire, stolen, destroyed, and all these other things have to happen. Well, let's use common sense. We have this bone, we got this whole skeleton. Why don't we just move it over? And the experts that really know this stuff, we're going to remember to look at the old one. Mm-hmm. And for the rest of the world, let's just make it less complicated. Let's make it research friendly. So it's quite troublesome. And I would welcome an ICZN person to explain to me why it's better, because I'm a form follows function kind of guy. And in my case, the form of the codification needs to follow the actual practical application of the taxonomic rules for utility. And we didn't make it. If we were writing this stuff today, we wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, can you tell us a bit about Fossil Crates and what inspired it?
Yeah, so Fossil Crates came about because of COVID. We launched in the ashes of COVID. The Arizona Museum of Natural History closed for almost 18 months. I don't like to sit around idle. I cobbled together, it was originally going to be express exhibits. We had this plan to bring really low cost exhibits to museums all over. So if you're a rural, middle of nowhere museum and you only have $200 a month, well, we can get you a cool display. And that was the plan. Except COVID closed all the museums down, including ours. So we decided to bring the museum home. We know people like dinosaurs. So I have access via all the collections I've been to really awesome material, often that's never been cast before. So I approached these museums. I said, hey, may I be permitted to make a mold and a cast or 3D scan and a 3D print of your material? So Torvosaurus canneri, the only Utah raptor hand claw, a bunch of cool specimens, the Megaraptor claw that needs a name from Argentina. In exchange, we'll give them a royalty, and that royalty helps fund field work, collections work, etc. And it's essentially monetizing the collection while bringing home to enthusiasts actual casts of material that was not sculpted. And it comes in a wooden crate in a burlap sack, just like we use in the field, with wooden shavings. And when you open it, there's a white envelope with a handwritten letter or signed letter. and information that I've taken from the primary literature, not lifted from Wikipedia. And then we provide artwork that I commission from up-and-coming artists, quite often teenagers from all over the world. We have a diverse stable of artists to give them a chance to show their wares off. And we put together this wonderful unboxing experience. And we launched it. And it did really well. People liked it. So we brought in scaled skulls. We have three-dimensional scans of incredibly cool skulls that we shrink down to various sizes. So it's like the Tufts Loves T-Rex. You can buy the original from us, or you can the cast, or you can shrink it down and get our really popular, I think it's 1/8 scale skull. It's amazing.
Nice.
And it's the skull. And we have we keep bringing skulls on every quarter or so. We just brought Pachycephalosaurus online from the Sandy specimen. Oh, it's so beautiful. And then we started selling individual items because not everyone wanted an unboxing experience, or how many crates do you really need? So our fans said, hey, we love you, but we don't want another crate stacked up. So we offer them individually and in cardboard crates as well now. So then from there, we offer merchandise. So that's a cool way to represent your favorite taxa. And we give merchandise royalties back to the museums as well. And then from Fossil Crates, we launched, people want to become paleontologists, PaleoPortals. Twice a month, we bring on live paleontologists. We brought yourselves on, other paleo enthusiasts, artists, curators. It's not just for the academics. So we did have John Hutchison last time, and we have Julia McHugh the next one. We bring students, graduate students. We want to help people become paleontologists. If you're interested, check us out at paleoportals.com/join. It's 30 days free. We do charge $10 a month right now, but it's really to keep it so the people that are there are very serious. It's really designed for members because I want to help the next generation become paleontologists. And then our other is express exhibits. Again, if you have a small museum or a big museum and you're looking for what's fish tank size, you've got a corner, you just want something cool in, let us know. We love working. We can go up to 10,000 square feet. I mean, we have a real full exhibits department. But my passion is working with the small museums, because just because you live in a rural locality with a very small, like a regional library, that doesn't mean you shouldn't get to see really cool specimens too. So that's kind of in a nutshell, we've been up to a lot of cool things.
Yeah, so many good resources.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we usually ask where to find you, but I think you've listed, we got PaleoPortals, we've got Fossil Crates, and is there a separate website for the exhibition?
Yeah, it's called expressexhibits.com. We're all over socials. Almost every day you're going to get something cool and new and fun. And definitely keep it lighthearted. Paleo is meant to be, at the end of the day, we are, what I call us is the steam engine, like the science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Paleontology. So we're the Fossil Crates, we're the Steam Express. Come on board. We're the coal car because we're paleo. And all the other sciences and art and engineering are on our train. So the likelihood of you become a paleontologist in reality is very little. But you can be on our train and learn the thought process of paleo and science in general, and then you'll jump off at various stops along your life and go become an engineer, a computer scientist, an artist. But you were on our train to begin with, and we welcome everyone aboard.
And you can always come back.
Yeah, that's what we did.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, a lot of great resources for our listeners to check out.
Oh, yeah. And great stories. Thank you for sharing.
Anytime. I love what you guys do. Thank you so much. I appreciate it all.
Thank you so much, Brian, for chatting with us. We love hearing your stories and, of course, hearing more about sauropods.
Of course. And in just a moment, we'll get into our dinosaur of the day, Priconodon. But first, we're going to pause for one last sponsor break.
And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Priconodon, which was a request from Buttceratops via Patreon and Discord. So thanks. It was a nodosaurid, getting back to the nodosaurs, that lived in the early Cretaceous in what is now Maryland in the U.S. And it was found in the Arundel Formation and Potomac.
You got it. We were looking at each other because the first time we went to D.C., Sabrina was like, the Potomac. Like the Potomac. It's very famous.
Because that's what happens when you grow up on the West Coast.
Yeah.
The Potomac group.
Yep. Nailed it.
Okay, thanks. Priconodon is only really known from the teeth, so it's hard to say what it looked like or how big it was. But as a nodosaurid, it would have probably walked on four legs and been low to the ground and then been covered in armor and have no tail club. The type species is Priconodon crassus, and the genus name means sawcone tooth.
Sawcone.
Yep.
Eh.
And the species name means thick. It was named by Marsh in 1888, so it's a Bone Wars dinosaur. Not surprising, named from the teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, he named it based on a large tooth. He compared it to Priconodon, which is now known as Stegosaurus. The tooth had a large root and it was worn. It was described as a worn tooth. Marsh wrote that there were a number of fragmentary remains which were not found with the tooth, and the tooth he named as the holotype specimen, and he said these remains would be, quote, described more fully elsewhere. So he described the tooth as having a, quote, narrow neck, a swollen base, and flattened crown, and that the, quote, serrated edges meet above at a sharp angle.
Sounds like a cone.
Yep. Now, Lowell later recognized 5 more Priconodon teeth and found them to be similar to Paleoscincus, which is a now dubious ankylosaur also named from teeth found in what is now Montana. Lowell also referred to a vertebral centrum as Priconodon, but Gilmore later tentatively assigned that to Ornithomimus and said that it was part of the sacrum, which connects to the pelvis. In 1921, Gilmore wrote that though how we classified armored dinosaurs at that time, quote, is somewhat in confusion, end quote, recent discoveries that had not yet been described, again, this is in 1921, show Priconodon should probably be classified as a nodosaurid rather than a stegosaurid based on the size of its tooth, features, and wear. And then in 1978, Walter Coombs also said that the tooth belonged to a nodosaur. Now, some scientists think that Priconodon is dubious, but others agree that it's valid. In 1998, Kenneth Carpenter and Jim Kirkland published a review of early Cretaceous ankylosaurs found in North America and found Priconodon to be a valid dinosaur and to be a large nodosaurid.
Oh.
Yes.
There's a big tooth, so they think it was a big nodosaurid?
Well, they also found 12 more isolated teeth from the same area where the holotype was found, and they also tentatively referred a left tibia or shin bone to Priconodon.
That's much more helpful, yeah.
And this left tibia came from a coffee mine in Muirkirk, Maryland. The tibia, it's stout like other nodosaurids, and it's about 12 inches or 31 centimeters long.
Yeah.
Now, Carpenter and Kirkland wrote, quote, "We find it peculiar that no armor plates have yet been reported from the Arundel Formation," end quote. But they said that doesn't mean Priconodon didn't have armor. They said, quote, "Instead, we advocate that either we are mistaken and Priconodon is not an ankylosaur, or that it is simply fortuitous that armor has not yet been found. This should not be surprising considering how few fossils have been found in the Arundel."
Yeah, that's a good point, because the thing that fossilizes the best is usually teeth. And if all you're finding is teeth and then the one shin bone, there's a decent chance that it's like, well, we're only finding a very few things, and that's why we're not finding the osteoderms.
Yes.
Or maybe it's like the first ever non-osteoderm having nodosaurid, but that would be way less likely.
I mean, it would be interesting, but that's very hard to say.
Yeah.
In 2004, Alex West and Neil Tibbert also found Priconodon to be valid by comparing its teeth to other nodosaurids and ankylosaurs. And the teeth are different from other nodosaurid teeth because they are so large. The tooth size ranges from it's around half an inch, or 1 to 1.5 centimeters long, and about 0.3 to half an inch, or 0.7 to 1.4 centimeters tall. That's according to Carpenter and Kirkland.
What a massive tooth. Full half an inch.
Well, yeah, on paper or just talking about it, it doesn't sound that impressive, but when I get out a ruler and started looking at it, like, yeah, that's a big tooth.
Yeah, for an ankylosaur.
Yeah, it's bigger than my teeth.
Some of them. Maybe all of them. I don't know. I haven't measured your teeth.
And you don't need to. So for comparison, the largest Edmontonia teeth were about 0.45 inches, or roughly 1.2 centimeters long, and about 0.4 inches, or 1.5 centimeters tall.
It's pretty similar.
Yeah.
Except slightly taller.
Slightly taller, but slightly not as long. Shorter.
Yeah, it depends what end of the range
Mm-hmm.
for the other one.
Other animals that lived around the same time and place as Priconodon included pterosaurs, sharks, lungfish, turtles, and crocodilians, and then dinosaurs such as Carcharodontosaurids, dromaeosaurs, ornithischians, ceratopsians, Most of these are known from fragments and teeth and considered to be indeterminate members of their group, so it's not too specific which kinds of dinosaurs.
That's why you threw out ornithischians.
Yep.
Usually we can get a little more specific than that, but I guess not in this case.
Not from this formation. At this time.
Not yet. And our fun fact of the day is that ankylosaur heads are one of the most complex armored body parts in the animal kingdom.
Of course.
They're so cool. So, at the back of an ankylosaur head, you often find 4 horns. You've got the quadratojugal horns sticking out of the bottom back corners of the skull, and the squamosal horns sticking out of the top back corners of the head. So you get this sort of cool 4-horned things. It almost looks like if you were to put it vertically on a table, like it would hold itself up with those 4 horns on some skulls, like a rocket ship or something, ready to take off with little fins or something. They also sometimes have a horn or large ridge above the eye, and usually dozens of other pieces of armor around the head, especially as the animals get older. Some of the young ones are more skull than armor, but yeah. Some of the armor is formed by osteoderms. Some are the bones of the skull itself, or also known as cranial sculpturing. And some are osteoderms fused to cranial sculpturing, sort of a combination of the two. It would be really difficult to describe and track which pieces of armor are which, whether they're osteoderms fused to the skull or skull itself. And getting it right consistently between researchers would be really hard, and was really hard. Fortunately, William Blowes came up with a solution in 2001 in the book The Armored Dinosaurs.
All right.
Basically, every piece of armor that isn't a horn is called a caputegulum, and the plural is caputegulae. I think that's the most correct way to say it in the anglicized Latin. I've seen it written a million times. I've never heard anybody say it. But it makes things much more simple when you use the word caputegulae, because you can directly compare ankylosaurs to one another much more easily. And when you're describing a new ankylosaur, when you say the name of the caputegulum, everyone knows the spot you're talking about without saying like, oh, there's this one type of boss or this horn in this area, which would be way more confusing. As an example, I'll use my favorite caputegulum.
Okay.
Obviously, it's the posterior supraorbital caputegulum.
Obviously.
It's very obvious. If you knew where it was, you might think it was obvious. So posterior means behind, supraorbital means above the eye. So it's basically above and behind the eye on an ankylosaur, which is essentially the brow of an ankylosaur.
That's your favorite?
I mean, I like the horns a little better, but as far as the caputegulum are concerned.
Fair.
So on Zool, Euoplocephalus, and Zeopelta, it's really pointy, and it almost looks like a miniature version of the squamosal horn, which is right behind it. And they're really beautiful. It just looks like this big, spiky, awesome brow horn thing that they have coming out of the side of the head. It's so cool. Anodontosaurus, on the other hand, is very different. Although Anodontosaurus has a really awesome, wide, pointy tail club, its posterior supraorbital caputegulum is way less awesome. It's pretty flat to the skull. But since we have the same name for it, we don't have to worry about getting bogged down if in Zool it counts as a horn or a boss or a scute or an osteoderm that's fused to the skull. We just can describe it based on the way it's shaped, which is really what you use when you're describing different ankylosaurs. So it's very helpful. And as you were saying earlier, the skulls of ankylosaurs are like the most important part of the body, so it's very good to have the language where you can directly compare it. And I love ankylosaurs and their posterior supraorbital caputegulae.
Try saying that 10 times fast.
I can barely say it one time slow.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to easily access the sources for the news items we covered this week, head over to iknowdino.com in our show notes. And stay tuned. Next week, we'll be talking to Anjay and Kara, who, along with Hans Zimmer, worked on the soundscape for Prehistoric Planet.
Oh, yeah.
Both seasons. And we'll be chatting with them shortly before season 2 of Prehistoric Planet premieres.
Yep. Get excited.
Yes, we're excited. Thank you for listening, and until next time.
Good day.